In 1932, the United States faced an unemployment rate that soared to nearly 25%, a staggering figure translating to over 12 million people without jobs. This reality was not just a statistic, it was a daily struggle, a relentless tide of despair sweeping through families and communities. Across the nation, towns once bustling with life fell silent, with many people forced to make a choice between food or rent. In Chicago, men gathered in long lines, clutching worn-out hats, hoping to catch a glimpse of a job opportunity that seemed to vanish before it could be grasped. The Great Depression was not merely an economic downturn. It was a profound crisis that battered the very fabric of American society. In a modest home on the south side of Chicago, a family of 5 was awakening to another bleak morning. The faint, muffled sounds of the city began to stir just before dawn, the streets still cloaked in the soft grey of early light. The aroma of stale bread mixed with the bitter scent of coffee hung in the air, remnants of yesterday's meager meal. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, a persistent reminder of time's cruel march amidst their stagnant lives. Mabel Johnson, a mother of 3, rose from the threadbare couch that served as both her bed and a gathering place for her children. At 35, she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. The youngest, little Billy, was still wrapped in a thin blanket, his small body curled tightly to preserve warmth in the chilly morning air. The family's savings had long been depleted, and Mabel's heart sank at the thought of what the day might bring. The last few dollars were spent on food just yesterday, and today she had nothing left. Mabel glanced at her eldest son, 12-year-old Tommy, who was already up, his face set with determination. He had taken to running errands for neighbors, earning a few cents here and there, but it was never enough. Today, he planned to visit the local soup kitchen, where he hoped to bring back something, anything, to stave off hunger for one more day. "Tommy," Mabel called softly, her voice a mix of encouragement and worry, "be careful out there. There are reports of people getting into fights over scraps." The tension that hung in the air was palpable. Just last week, a scuffle had broken out at the kitchen when a group of men, desperate and hungry, clashed over a meager offering of bread. The police had to be called in, and for many, the realization that desperation could lead to violence was a stark reminder of how fragile their situation had become. As Tommy prepared to leave, he turned, looking back at Mabel with an expression that betrayed his fear. "What if there's nothing left for us, Ma? What will we do then?" The question lingered, heavy in the air, as the enormity of their plight settled like a stone in Mabel's stomach. Her heart raced. The stakes were rising. With the New Deal program still in their infancy, hope for relief seemed distant. Would the government's promise of jobs and recovery ever reach them? Or would they be left to navigate the storm alone, fighting for survival in a world that felt increasingly indifferent? As the sun began to rise, casting a pale light through the grimy windows, one question echoed in Mabel's mind. How much longer could they endure this struggle? Before dawn on the south side of Chicago, a chill lingered in the air, sifting through the gaps in the worn wooden walls of the Johnson household. Mabel Johnson stirred awake, her breath visible in the early morning light that barely filtered through the grimy window panes. It was 1932, and the Great Depression tightened its grip on families like hers, where every moment counted and hope was a scarce commodity. As she pushed herself up from the thin mattress, Mabel glanced at the makeshift clock on the wall, its hands barely grazing 6. The days of sleeping in were long gone. Survival dictated a different rhythm now. Her stomach rumbled as she recalled the sparse remnants of the previous night's supper, leftover cornmeal mush mixed with a few wilted greens. Breakfast would be no different. Many in the neighborhood had taken to eating whatever they could scrounge. A few slices of bread or a bowl of oatmeal were considered a feast on most days. Mabel moved quietly to the kitchen, its linoleum floor cold beneath her bare feet. She filled a pot with water, setting it on the stove, which had been a gift from a neighbor who had moved away. This morning, as with many others, she planned to make a thin porridge from the last of the oats. The price of food was spiraling higher. A loaf of bread now cost nearly 10 cents, and the family couldn't afford to waste anything. Just last week, the grocer had warned her that the price of flour was set to rise again, driven by poor harvests and inflation that seemed relentless. Tommy, her eldest son, roused from his sleep, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. At 15, he was already burdened with the weight of adult worries. The world outside was not kind to boys with no prospects. The unemployment rate had climbed to a staggering 25%, and each day seemed to bring new fears. "Ma, what are we having?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. "Just some oatmeal, Tommy," Mabel replied, her tone gentle yet strained. "We'll make it stretch. Maybe we can find a little sugar to sprinkle in if there's any left." Sugar had become a luxury. Mabel's heart sank at the thought of their dwindling supplies, but she pushed it aside. "Get Billy up, will you? He needs to eat before he heads to school." Tommy nodded, trudging toward the small room shared by himself and his younger brother. As he entered, the room was dim, illuminated only by the faint light creeping through the curtains. Billy lay curled up under a blanket, his small frame barely making a dent in the thin mattress. The boy was only 10, still innocent to the harsh realities of their lives, but even he felt the tension that hung in the air. "Billy, wake up," Tommy said, shaking him gently. "Time for breakfast." "Is it school day?" Billy mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "Yep," Tommy responded, his voice tinged with a mix of reluctance and responsibility. As the eldest, he often felt the need to shield Billy from the burdens that weighed on their mother's shoulders. Across the street, at the local factory, the sound of machinery whirred to life. Before dawn, men and women had already arrived for their shifts, some working for a mere 30 cents an hour, if they were lucky. Many were without work altogether. Mabel had heard rumors of men standing in long lines at the soup kitchen, a stark reminder of how precarious their existence had become. By the time the porridge was simmering, Mabel gathered the family around the small table. It was a simple affair, the wood chipped and stained, but it held memories and the remnants of laughter from better days. They sat in silence, the clinking of spoons against bowls the only sound interrupting their thoughts. Mabel bowed her head, murmuring a prayer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lord, grant us strength for today and provide for our needs." It was a ritual steeped in hope, one she clung to despite the uncertainty that shadowed her family. Tommy glanced up, a flicker of anxiety crossing his face. "Ma, what if they cut the school budget again?" Mabel sighed. The news had been grim. Education was often the first casualty in tough times, and there were whispers that funding would be slashed further. "We can't worry about that now, Tommy. You focus on your studies. We'll figure it out." Billy, spooning the last remnants of porridge into his mouth, asked, "What if I can't go to school anymore?" "Then we'll find another way, won't we?" Mabel replied, trying to inject a sense of certainty into her words. "You're a smart boy. We'll make things work." As the boys finished their breakfast, Mabel noticed a small piece of paper on the table. It had slipped from one of Tommy's books, a notice about an upcoming meeting at the local union. It was a call to action, a chance for workers to gather and discuss their plight. The labor movement was gaining momentum, driven by the desperation of those who had lost everything. "Tommy, what's this?" she asked. Tommy hesitated before answering. "Just something I found. I thought I'd check it out." "Be careful, son," Mabel cautioned. "Things are tense out there. I've heard about protests turning violent. I know, Ma, he replied, his expression serious. But we can't just sit and do nothing. It's not just us. There are families everywhere struggling. Mabel felt the weight of his words. The strike movements were growing, fueled by the frustration of those who had once held steady jobs and now found themselves on the brink of despair. The thought of her son getting involved filled her with equal parts pride and dread. Just promise me you'll stay safe, okay? Yeah, I will, he said, determination building in his voice. After breakfast, the boys grabbed their jackets and headed out into the cold morning. Mabel watched them go, a knot forming in her stomach. She knew that each day posed new dangers, not just from the elements, but from a society fraying at its seams. The streets were often filled with men loitering aimlessly, waiting for work that never came. Once they left, Mabel turned her thoughts back to the tasks at hand. She needed to gather the laundry from the line outside, but first, she took a moment to pray again. Her heart felt heavy with the burdens of the day ahead. The soup kitchen would open soon, and she would need to muster the courage to face the lines of people who would be gathered there, each one with their own story of loss. By the time she stepped outside, the sun had just begun to rise, casting a greyish hue over the bleak landscape. The air was crisp, and the sounds of the city waking up surrounded her. Trains rumbling in the distance, the faint honking of horns, and the occasional shout of a vendor setting up for the day. As she bent to pick up the laundry, she spotted a group of men gathered at the corner, their faces drawn and weary. They were likely waiting to hear news of work, or perhaps to join the growing ranks of the unemployed. The sight of them sent a shiver through her. Mabel could feel the tension in the air, a palpable anxiety that mirrored her own. Today, the local union was expected to announce their stance on a major strike, something that could either galvanize the workers or plunge them further into chaos. Returning inside, Mabel prepared for her day, her heart heavy with uncertainty. There was little she could control, but she had to try to keep her family safe and fed. The weight of her responsibilities settled on her shoulders like an anchor, pulling her deeper into the storm that was the Great Depression. The smell of damp clothes and unwashed dishes filled the air as she tidied up, bracing herself for what lay ahead. The world outside her door felt precarious, like a balance on the edge of a precipice. The day was young, but the stakes were high. With each passing hour, the lives of many would be tested as they faced the realities of a society struggling to hold itself together. Mabel knew that they would need every ounce of courage to face the challenges that awaited. As she looked out the window, she caught a glimpse of her boys walking toward the school. The path before them was fraught with uncertainty, but they walked with a determination that reminded her of the resilience she had always admired in them. Today would be another chapter in their story, a story of struggle, hope, and survival against all odds. But as she returned to her chores, she couldn't shake the sense that a storm was brewing, one that threatened to upend their fragile existence. It was a day like any other, yet it was also a day that would bring change, change that could alter the course of their lives forever. As Mabel Johnson stepped out of her modest home on the south side of Chicago, the chill of a late October morning cut through her thin coat. It was 1932, and the streets echoed with the desperate clatter of a city grappling with despair. The air carried the scent of coal smoke and dust, remnants of a once thriving industrial hub now struggling under the weight of the Great Depression. Mabel's heart raced as she thought of the day ahead. One more effort to scrape together a few dollars to feed her family. The Johnson household had already begun to fray under the pressures of unemployment. Tommy, her eldest son, was determined to help. He had found work at a local factory, earning a meager wage of 30 cents an hour, which was barely enough to cover a loaf of bread priced at 10 cents. Each day, he rose before the sun, his youthful hopes dimmed by the reality of a workplace where laborers were often exploited. The National Industrial Recovery Act, enacted earlier that year, aimed to stabilize prices and wages, but in practice, it often left workers like Tommy with scant protection against the whims of their employers. Mabel watched Tommy leave, his shoulders hunched against the cold. The factory was located just a few blocks away, but the journey felt monumental. As he walked, she recalled the words of the labor organizer, John L. Lewis, who had called for solidarity among workers, urging them to join unions for better wages and working conditions. "It's not just about survival," he had said at a rally. "It's about dignity." Yet, in a world where 1 in 4 Americans were unemployed, dignity felt like a luxury. As she prepared for her own day, Mabel faced her own set of challenges. With a dwindling pantry, she needed to visit the local soup kitchen. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration had begun distributing food to families in need, yet the lines stretched for blocks. Mabel often waited for hours, her stomach knotting with worry over whether they would still have bread for dinner. Last week, she had seen a woman in front of her faint from hunger, collapsing onto the cold pavement. The sight haunted her, a reminder of how fragile their lives had become. On her way to the soup kitchen, Mabel passed a small grocery store. She peered through the window, her heart heavy. A bag of flour had risen to 40 cents, a price that felt like a mountain to climb. Just last year, it had cost half as much. To make matters worse, the price of fresh produce had skyrocketed. A single tomato was now 15 cents, a luxury far beyond her reach. The government's attempts to stabilize prices through the Agricultural Adjustment Act had failed to reach those who needed it most. Instead, farmers were paid to reduce their crop yield, leaving many urban families starving while food rotted in the fields. Arriving at the soup kitchen, Mabel joined the line, her thoughts consumed by the uncertainty of their future. Each face around her told a story of loss. Men who once wore suits now stood in tattered coats, women with weary eyes cradling children who didn't understand why their bellies grumbled. A sign on the wall proclaimed, "No one will be turned away," but Mabel knew that each handout came with a price tag of dignity lost. Inside, the kitchen hummed with activity. Volunteers ladled out steaming soup into bowls, the aroma of vegetables and broth creating a temporary refuge from the cold reality outside. A grizzled man served Mabel, his hands shaking as he filled her bowl. "2 cups today, Mabel. You'll need it," he said, his voice a mixture of kindness and sadness. This was a man who had once worked in steel mills, whose name she could no longer recall. She nodded gratefully, her heart swelling with relief and guilt in equal measure. Meanwhile, Tommy arrived at the factory, the towering brick building looming over him like a fortress. The noise of machinery rattled through the air, drowning out the whispers of discontent among workers. He clocked in, joining a line of weary faces, each man and woman a cog in a vast grinding system. The factory was producing war materials, a prelude to the global conflict that would soon erupt. But for them, it was a double-edged sword. The demand meant jobs, yet the work was grueling, with long hours and little pay. As the day progressed, the foreman's voice boomed over the cacophony, barking orders that echoed like a distant thunder. "Keep those machines running, folks. We're behind schedule." Tommy's hands moved mechanically, tightening bolts and assembling parts, while his mind drifted to his younger brother Billy. What would happen if he lost this job? What would happen to Mabel and Billy? With the uncertainty of the economy hanging over them like a dark cloud, anxiety gnawed at him. At lunchtime, Tommy sat with a few co-workers, their brown bags revealing meager offerings. "You hear about the strikes?" one of them asked, his brow furrowed. They're demanding $1 an hour. Can you believe it? The others nodded, a mix of hope and disbelief flickering in their eyes. The United Auto Workers had organized a series of strikes throughout the Midwest, advocating for better wages and working conditions. Yet the specter of retaliation loomed large. Many had already lost their jobs for participating, and fear had a way of silencing even the most desperate pleas for justice. Yeah, but what can we do? Tommy replied quietly. If we strike, we'll just end up like those men out on the streets. The conversation fell quiet, each worker lost in his thoughts. Outside, the sound of a distant siren wailed, a reminder that the city was on edge. The economy was faltering, and tensions were rising. Beneath the surface, a storm brewed, one that threatened to upend their already precarious lives. Back at the soup kitchen, Mabel stirred her soup, the warmth of the bowl cradled in her hands. As she ate, a conversation at the next table caught her attention. They're talking about a march, a woman whispered, her voice barely above a breath. To demand better wages and jobs. But what will it change? Mabel listened intently, her heart pounding. The idea of collective action sparked a flicker of hope within her, a notion that perhaps they were not alone in their struggle. The conversation shifted, voices rising as they spoke of the striking workers and the growing unrest in the city. They say the police are ready to crack down, another woman warned. They don't want us making noise. Mabel felt a knot form in her stomach. She knew too well the power imbalance that existed, the way workers were often pitted against the law. In 1931, a clash between strikers and police in San Francisco had turned violent, leaving many injured. As Mabel left the soup kitchen, her bowl empty but her heart full of thoughts, she knew she had to find a way to support her family. The resilience of the community around her ignited a spark of courage. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to demand change, to fight for the dignity of hard work that had been stripped from them all. Tommy returned home that evening, his hands raw and his body exhausted. The factory had pushed them harder than ever, with talk of overtime looming. He entered the house, greeted by the comforting smell of the soup Mabel had brought home. "How was work?" she asked, her eyes searching his for signs of hope or despair. "Long," he replied, sinking into a chair. "But they're saying there might be a strike." Mabel's heart raced. "Do you think it will happen?" she asked, fear and hope mingling in her voice. Tommy shrugged, the weight of uncertainty heavy on his shoulders. "I don't know, Ma, but if it does, it could mean everything." As they sat together, the flickering light from the lone candle cast shadows on the walls, mirroring the uncertainty of their future. Mabel thought of her neighbors, the faces she had seen in line for soup, the stories shared over bowls of broth. The idea of standing together began to take root in her mind, growing stronger with each passing moment. That night, as they gathered around the table, Mabel shared her thoughts. Maybe we should join them, stand up for ourselves. Tommy looked at her, surprised by her boldness. But what if we lose everything? What if we can't find work again? "We've already lost so much," Mabel replied softly. "What more do we have to lose?" In the silence that followed, filled only by the soft crackle of the candle flame, they contemplated the path ahead. Amid the despair, a flicker of determination ignited within them. Together, they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The march toward change had begun to take shape in their hearts, a whisper of hope in a world drowning in darkness. The stakes had risen. The fabric of their lives was woven from struggle and resilience. In the heart of the Great Depression, Mabel and Tommy stood at the crossroads of labor and commerce, a moment that would define their journey, a moment where they would decide together to reclaim their dignity. Mabel Johnson stood by the worn kitchen table, the linoleum floor cool beneath her tired feet. It was just past noon on a grey day in 1932, a year when the echoes of despair rang in every corner of America. The smell of the few ingredients she had on hand filled the small room, a mix of faintly burnt bread and wilted vegetables that whispered of better times. The Great Depression had tightened its grip, and food, once a source of comfort, had become a constant worry. The sharp pangs of hunger echoed in her belly, a reminder that the Johnson family was among the millions struggling to survive. As she searched through the sparse pantry, Mabel's fingers brushed against a sack of flour, its weight a small relief amid the uncertainty. Flour had soared to 40 cents a pound, a price that reflected the scarcity of food that plagued the nation. In 1932, food prices had risen sharply, and the average American family was spending close to 1/3 of its income on essentials. For the Johnsons, that meant every meal was a delicate balance between hunger and what little they could afford. She glanced at the clock. Tommy would be back from school soon, and Billy would follow shortly after. Their midday meal had to be both filling and frugal. She poured water into a pot, watching as it sloshed against the sides. If she could stretch the flour with a little water and salt, perhaps they could have dumplings. It wasn't much, but in a time when the unemployment rate reached 25%, it was a small victory. The Great Depression had starkly divided the classes, and food was one of the most visible rifts. The wealthy dined on lavish spreads, their tables adorned with rich meats and fresh produce, while the working class scraped by on meals that were often little more than sustenance. Mabel recalled stories of the city's elite, their lavish dinners featuring roasted meats, fresh vegetables, and decadent desserts. In contrast, the Johnsons often settled for simple fare, the occasional stew made from scraps, or a meager bowl of oatmeal thickened with water. "Ma, what's for lunch?" Tommy's voice broke through her thoughts. He entered the kitchen, his schoolbooks clutched tightly to his chest. The sight of his eager face made Mabel's heart ache. She wanted to tell him about the hearty meals they used to have, the times when she'd prepare meatloaf with mashed potatoes or bake a pie from fresh fruit. "Just some dumplings, honey," she replied, forcing a smile. "I'll add some carrots if we can find any in the garden." "Can I help?" Tommy's eyes lit up, and he hurried to wash his hands. "I can knead the dough." "All right, but be careful," she said, her tone softening. "We need to save every scrap we can." As they worked together, Mabel felt a moment of warmth. The kitchen, though small, was filled with the sounds of laughter and clattering utensils. They mixed the flour with water, creating a sticky dough that would soon be rolled out and cut into shapes. Each dumpling would be a small triumph in their daily fight against hunger. Billy bounded into the kitchen moments later, his cheeks flushed from the cold outside. "What's that smell?" he asked excitedly, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Dumplings, little man. Can you help me chop some carrots?" Mabel replied, gesturing to the few limp vegetables on the counter. Billy nodded vigorously, eager to assist. As he grabbed a knife, carefully supervised by Mabel, she couldn't help but remember the school lunches he had shared with his classmates. While many children enjoyed sandwiches filled with meat and cheese, Billy often brought a simple slice of bread, perhaps with a thin spread of butter if they were lucky. The rations provided by the soup kitchen were not enough to fill the gaps left by missing meals at school. In the background, the radio buzzed with news of the worsening economic situation. A report mentioned how nearly 12 million Americans were unemployed, a staggering figure that loomed over every household. The Great Depression had invaded not just their wallets, but their very souls, and the specter of hunger was omnipresent. "Did you hear about the soup kitchen?" Tommy asked, his voice low. "They're running out of food too." Mabel nodded, her heart sinking. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration had been set up to provide aid, yet even those rations were dwindling. The kitchen had seen long lines of desperate families, their faces etched with worry. "Yes, we'll need to go tomorrow if we can," she replied. "Make sure you and Billy are ready." The conversation shifted back to food as Mabel shaped the dumplings. "Did you learn anything new at school today?" she asked, trying to keep the atmosphere light. Tommy shrugged. "We learned about how people used to eat before the war. They had lots of different kinds of bread, and people could afford to buy fresh milk daily." Mabel paused, her hands stilling in the dough. "Yes, I remember those days," she said softly. "A quart of milk would cost only about 15 cents back then." The price seemed a world away now, as she thought of the powdered milk they had used in recent weeks, a substitute that lacked the richness of fresh dairy. As the dumplings boiled in the pot, Mabel set the table with care. She placed the chipped plates before each chair, a small act of normalcy amid the chaos of their lives. The tablecloth, once bright and cheerful, was faded from years of use, but it still held memories of family gatherings that felt like distant dreams now. "Lunch is ready," she called, her voice rising above the bubbling water. With each plate served, she felt a mix of pride and sadness. Today, they would have dumplings and broth, simple yet filling. It was a meal, yes, but it was also a reminder of how far they had fallen. Tommy and Billy rushed to the table, their faces lighting up as they caught sight of the steaming food. They each took a generous helping, their eyes wide with hope. Mabel watched them eat, her heart swelling with love and sorrow. "You boys have to eat slowly," she reminded them, her own hunger gnawing at her insides. Between bites, the boys chattered about their day, their voices a comforting hum in the small kitchen. They spoke of their friends, the games they played, and the growing fears of what tomorrow would bring. Mabel listened, her mind drifting to what life used to be like before the crash. In those days, families enjoyed picnics in the park, sharing fried chicken and potato salad, laughing together without worry. Now, such meals felt like a distant memory, a luxury out of reach. "Ma, do you think we'll ever eat like we used to?" Tommy asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. Mabel's heart ached at the question. "We will, Tommy. We just have to keep pushing through together." But even as she spoke, doubt gnawed at her. The memories of better meals lingered in her mind. Thanksgiving turkeys, Christmas hams, and birthday cakes. Each recollection was a reminder of the class divide that had become painfully evident in their daily lives. The wealthier families were still able to feast, while the Johnsons struggled to find enough to fill their plates. The radio crackled with news again, pulling Mabel from her thoughts. The announcer spoke of the growing unrest among workers, of strikes across the country demanding better wages and living conditions. John L. Lewis, the leader of the United Mine Workers, had called for action, but families like hers felt the weight of the struggle more than ever. The fight for dignity intertwined with their hunger, and Mabel knew the stakes were high. As they finished their meal, a knock echoed through the thin walls of their home. Mabel exchanged glances with Tommy and Billy, a flicker of concern crossing her face. "Stay here," she whispered, wiping her hands on her apron before heading to the door. Opening it cautiously, she found a neighbor standing there, his face drawn and weary. "Mabel, have you heard?" he asked urgently, his voice low. "There's been a riot at the factory. They're demanding food, and it's not pretty." Mabel's heart raced. The crisis was escalating, the tension in the air palpable. The fight for survival had turned into something more dangerous, and she knew she had to protect her boys. "Thank you for telling me," she said, her voice steady. "We'll stay inside." As she closed the door, a chill ran down her spine. The world outside was changing, and with it, the very fabric of their lives. Food, which had once been a source of joy, now stood as a battleground, a stark reminder of the differences that separated them from those who dined more comfortably. Returning to the table, she saw Tommy and Billy looking up at her, their eyes wide with confusion. "What's happening, Ma?" Tommy asked, concern etching his young face. Mabel took a deep breath, her heart heavy. "There's been some trouble, boys. But for now, we need to focus on each other. Let's clean up and think about dinner." As the boys helped her clear the table, the weight of their reality settled in. The Great Depression had not only taken their food, but threatened to take their peace as well. In this moment, Mabel understood that every meal counted. Each dumpling served was both a comfort and a reminder of the resilience she had to instill in her children. The world outside roared with unrest, but within their small home, love and determination would be their greatest sustenance. By mid-afternoon, the streets of Chicago's South Side were alive with the muted sounds of daily life, punctuated by the weight of uncertainty. Mabel Johnson, having just returned from the soup kitchen, wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out to join the throng of neighbors gathered outside the local grocery store. The store, a small brick building with peeling paint and a creaky door, had become a makeshift gathering place for the community, a spot where whispers echoed louder than the bustle of the city. The air was thick with the scent of coal smoke from nearby homes, mixed with the faint whiff of the day's bread, freshly baked and still warm. Its allure almost a cruel reminder of what was once a staple. "Did you hear about the new law they passed?" a woman named Agnes demanded, her voice cutting through the afternoon chatter. She stood with her arms crossed, her brow furrowed in both concern and defiance. On March 6, 1932, the federal government had enacted the Emergency Banking Act, a response to the widespread bank failures that had left countless families in despair. They're saying they might close down more banks if they don't get their act together. Mabel listened intently, her heart sinking further with each new piece of news. What will we do if they shut down the few that are left? She thought, glancing at her children playing nearby with a few rocks they had found. They were blissfully unaware of the precariousness of their existence. The mood was somber. The weight of collective anxiety hung heavily in the air, a cloak that wrapped around each person present. Tommy, now standing next to Mabel, leaned in. "They're saying unemployment might hit 30% soon," he remarked, his voice barely above a whisper. "And what if the steel mills close? That's where half the dads around here work." His eyes darted toward the group of men huddled together, their faces etched with worry. The steel industry, once a pillar of the American economy, was faltering under the weight of the Depression, and workers like Tommy's father faced an uncertain future. As the conversation swirled around them, Mabel caught snippets of gossip about families losing their homes and the rising cost of food. "Did you see how much a loaf of bread costs now?" one woman exclaimed. 40 cents for bread? What's next? Are we going to barter for a meal?" The price of flour had risen sharply, and with it, the cost of basic staples. Families were struggling to stretch their meager resources, and the thought of food prices continuing to climb filled Mabel with dread. Across the street, a group of teenagers stood nearby, their laughter a stark contrast to the somber conversations of the adults. Yet even their carefree demeanor couldn't mask the underlying tension. "Did you hear about that man who was executed last week? They say he was innocent," one girl remarked, her voice filled with a mix of curiosity and horror. "They found him guilty of stealing a loaf of bread to feed his family." The execution of a desperate father, a victim of a system that had long since abandoned its people, reverberated through the community, igniting a sense of anger and fear. Just last month, they tried to pass a new law to increase the penalties for theft, Agnes chimed in, her voice rising with indignation. Can you believe it? Instead of helping us, they want to punish us more. It's madness." The sentiment resonated with many in the crowd, their shared frustrations bubbling to the surface. The federal government's indifference to the suffering of ordinary citizens felt like salt in the wound. Mabel couldn't help but think of the broader implications. The New Deal was still in its early days, and while President Franklin D. Roosevelt's plans promised relief, many in her community were yet to see tangible benefits. The Works Progress Administration had only just begun to roll out its programs, and skepticism was rampant. "How long until we see changes?" she pondered, feeling the weight of her family's needs pressing down on her shoulders. Suddenly, the conversation shifted as a man named Joe, known for his boisterous nature, stepped into the center of the gathering. "Listen up, everyone. There's a meeting tonight at the church," he announced, his voice booming with urgency. "The union's organizing a rally. They want to talk about how we can fight for better wages and working conditions. We need to make our voices heard." His call to action sparked a moment of hope among the crowd, a flicker of unity amidst the despair. "Do you think they'll listen to us?" Tommy asked, his youthful face a mixture of eagerness and doubt. Mabel placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes all we can do is try," she said softly, though uncertainty gnawed at her. The rally could be a chance for change, but would it be enough? Would it reach the ears of those in power who had the means to enact real change? As the afternoon wore on, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the streets. The chatter began to quiet, replaced by the sound of children's laughter and the distant clanking of pots from nearby homes. Mabel took a deep breath, steeling herself for the evening ahead. The meeting at the church would be a turning point, a moment where voices could rise in unison against the tide of despair. "We'll go together," she told Tommy, who had been listening intently. "We need to stand up for what's right, for ourselves and for your little brother." The thought of Billy, who was still too young to understand the weight of their struggles, filled Mabel with a sense of determination. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue across the neighborhood, Mabel gathered her boys and headed home. The gathering had offered a mix of dread and hope, a reflection of the times they lived in. But as they walked, Mabel felt a flicker of resilience igniting within her. The fight for survival was far from over, but perhaps, just perhaps, they could carve out a space for their voices amidst the chaos. That evening, the church hall would fill with neighbors eager to discuss the rally, to share their fears, and to strategize about the future. And in that gathering, Mabel hoped to find strength, not just for herself, but for her children, for the community, and for the countless others struggling against the tide of the Great Depression. As she prepared dinner, the familiar scent of boiled potatoes filled the cramped kitchen. The steam curled up to the ceiling, mixing with the remnants of the day's worries. Mabel set the table with care, each fork and plate a small act of defiance against the uncertainty that loomed outside. And when Tommy and Billy sat down, the warmth of family wrapped around them like a fragile blanket against the harshness of the world. "Can we have bread with our dinner?" Billy asked innocently, his bright eyes looking up at Mabel with hope. She smiled, though her heart ached. "We'll have to make do with what we have," she replied, her voice steady. "But we'll make it together." In that moment, Mabel knew that while the path ahead was fraught with challenges, they would face it as a family, united by love and resilience. The realities of the Great Depression weighed heavily on them, but the spark of community and the will to fight for a better tomorrow shone brightly in their hearts. As the last rays of sunlight faded, the flicker of hope began to kindle once more, ready to ignite in the gathering at the church. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the Johnson family home, The evening air grew thick with the echoes of a day spent in survival. The clock on the wall ticked towards 6, a steady reminder of time passing. Yet for Mabel Johnson, the hours felt as heavy as the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. The kitchen, once a lively hub of laughter and chatter, now felt like a refuge from the outside's harsh realities. Yet even here, the spectre of worry loomed large. By March of 1932, the Great Depression had plunged families into despair. The unemployment rate was projected to reach 30%, while the average family struggled to make ends meet with dwindling resources. Mabel glanced at the small kitchen table, its surface worn and scratched, holding remnants of the day's efforts. A half-empty bowl of dumplings, a few wilted greens, and a solitary potato resting in the corner. Her stomach twisted as she thought of the families who had less than that, and she could not shake the image of the man she had heard of earlier, executed for stealing a loaf of bread. The price of bread had soared to 40 cents, a staggering sum for families like hers, where every penny was accounted for. "Tommy, help your brother with his homework," Mabel called out, her voice carrying a blend of authority and affection. She watched as Tommy, her eldest at 14, settled at the table with a pencil in hand, glancing over at Billy, who was perched on a stool, his small feet dangling just above the floor. Billy's brow furrowed as he struggled with his schoolwork, the weight of the day evident in his tired eyes. Evenings had become a time for educational pursuits, but the reality that surrounded them made it hard to concentrate. "I don't understand why we have to learn this stuff," Billy muttered, his frustration palpable as he pushed the papers away. "What good is school if we can't even eat?" "Because you need to know how to read and write," Tommy replied, his voice firm yet kind. "There might be a job for you one day. I want you to have more than we do now." Tommy's own heart was heavy. He had worked at the local factory since the last summer, earning a meager wage of 30 cents an hour, a figure that felt like a cruel joke when the cost of living continued to rise. Mabel stood by the stove, stirring the remnants of the broth she had managed to scrape together, the steam rising in gentle wisps. The kitchen was the only place she could exert some control in a world spiraling into chaos. Yet even here, the challenges of the outside world seeped in. The streets of Chicago's South Side were fraught with dangers that came alive after dark. Crime was rampant, with reports of theft and violence rising sharply. The local newspaper had warned of a 25% increase in robberies over the past year. Mabel's heart raced at the thought of her boys venturing out after dark, even for simple errands. "Remember to lock the door when you go out," she said, her voice laced with concern. "The night isn't safe." She couldn't help but think of the families who had suffered not only from hunger, but from the very real threat of violence that loomed in the shadows, an omnipresent reminder of the desperation that gripped the city. The boys nodded, their silence a testament to the unspoken fears that hung in the air. Mabel had worked hard to shield them from the worst of it, but the realities of the Great Depression were impossible to ignore. The mortality rates from diseases like tuberculosis and pneumonia surged during these years, particularly among the poorest families. The fear of illness was a constant companion, lurking just outside their door. As they sat around the table, the dim light of the single bulb overhead flickered, casting a weak glow on their faces. Mabel's heart warmed at the sight of her boys together, yet it was a warmth tinged with sorrow. She had done her best to provide for them, but as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the worry of tomorrow loomed larger than ever. She thought of the families in the soup kitchens, waiting for hours to receive a bowl of soup or a slice of bread, their faces etched with weariness, hope, and despair. "Mama," Billy's voice broke through her thoughts. pulling her back to the moment. What if we don't have enough food for tomorrow? There was a tremor in his voice, a reflection of the uncertainty that haunted them all. Mabel knelt beside him, brushing a stray hair from his forehead. We have enough for tonight, sweetheart. We'll figure it out tomorrow, just like we always do. She forced a smile, though inside, her heart ached. The truth was that she didn't know how they would make it through another week without more help. The boys needed new shoes, and she had overheard at the soup kitchen that the local church was running low on supplies. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Mabel's heart raced. "Stay here," she instructed, her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the doorknob. She opened the door cautiously, revealing a neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, standing on the porch, her face a mask of concern. "Mabel," she said, her voice low, "I heard you might be in need. I brought some things." She stepped forward, revealing a small sack filled with flour, a few cans of vegetables, and a loaf of bread. Still warm, the smell wafting into the room. "I made some extra today and thought you could use it." Mabel's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Mrs. Henderson, you don't know how much this means to us." She took the bag, feeling its weight and the kindness that came with it. "It's nothing, really. We're all in it together, aren't we?" Mrs. Henderson smiled, but Mabel could see the worry etched on her face. "Just be careful out there. I saw a group of young men down by the corner. I don't trust them." "Thank you," Mabel said, her voice thick with gratitude. "You're right. We'll be careful." She closed the door, her heart swelling with appreciation for the community that, though strained, still held together in moments like this. "Look, Billy," she called out, her spirits lifting as she set the bag on the table. "We have flour for pancakes tomorrow." She began to unpack the sack, her heart buoyed by the unexpected generosity. The evening's darkness felt a little less oppressive now, a small light flickering against the storm of uncertainty outside. Tommy and Billy rushed to help, their previous worries momentarily forgotten as they marveled at the bounty. "Can we have pancakes for breakfast?" Billy asked, his eyes wide with excitement, a smile breaking through the tension that had clouded their evening. "Of course, we can," Mabel replied, her heart warmed by the joy in her children's voices. The kitchen, filled with the aroma of the evening meal, transformed into a sanctuary, a place where laughter could still find a home amid the chaos. As they prepared for bed, Mabel tucked Billy in, her fingers brushing against the rough fabric of the blankets. "You sleep tight, little one," she whispered, planting a soft kiss on his forehead. "Tomorrow will be better." In the dim light of the room, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The day had been fraught with struggles. Yet here, in the quiet of the night, there was a semblance of peace. The sounds of the city outside, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional shout of laughter, and the unyielding rhythm of life, reminded her that even in despair, hope could flicker like a candle against the dark. Mabel made her way to Tommy's room, finding him staring out the window, lost in thought. "What's on your mind?" she asked softly. "I just wish things were different, Mama," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his years. "I want a better life for us." "Me too," she replied, her heart aching with the truth of his words. "But we have each other, and that means something. We've made it this far, haven't we?" "We have," he agreed, but there was a lingering sadness in his tone, a worry that she could not dispel. "Get some rest, Tommy," she urged, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Tomorrow, we will find a way to keep going, just like we always do." As she turned to leave, Mabel caught her breath, taking in the quiet of the house. She felt the day's burdens shift slightly off her shoulders. She climbed into her own bed, the sheets rough against her skin, but familiar. She closed her eyes, allowing the sounds of the city to lull her into a fragile peace. The night stretched out before her, filled with the unknown, But for now, in this moment, she allowed herself to hope. Tomorrow would come, with all its challenges and uncertainties. But tonight, they were together, and that was enough. The flicker of a flame in a darkened room, a small, stubborn light against the shadows. As night fell upon the south side of Chicago in March 1932, the streets grew quieter, but not peaceful. The shadows crept into every corner, swallowing the weary remnants of daylight. The world was suspended in a delicate balance of despair and resilience. In the flickering glow of street lamps, watchmen patrolled the desolate avenues, their feet echoing softly on the cracked pavement. Paid a mere 50 cents for a night's work, they kept vigilant eyes on the empty storefronts, remnants of a once bustling economy. Their presence was a fragile assurance for those who dared to leave their homes after dark. Across the city, the tales of crime were whispered in fearful tones. Robberies had surged by 25% since the onset of the Great Depression. For many desperate souls, the choice between starvation and theft weighed heavily on their conscience. A man had recently been executed for stealing a loaf of bread, his fate a grim reminder of the law's unforgiving nature. In the darkness, a group of men huddled in an alleyway, their furtive glances revealing a shared desperation, a silent acknowledgement of the lengths they would go to survive. In the heart of the Johnson household, the day's struggles faded as Mabel Johnson tucked her sons into bed. The warmth of their small home felt like a sanctuary amidst the chaos of the world outside. Yet, as she pulled the quilt up to Billy's chin, her mind wrestled with the realities of motherhood in this turbulent time. The statistics weighed on her like a heavy cloak. In cities across America, maternal mortality rates had soared. 1 in every 5 mothers did not survive childbirth. The fear that came with each of her sons' births lingered in her heart like a spectre, haunting her thoughts. Tommy lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the shadows dancing above him. He thought of the factory where he worked, the relentless clang of machinery that echoed in his ears, even in sleep. At 14, he earned 30 cents an hour, but with every passing day, that wage felt like a fleeting promise. He longed for a time when he could bring home more than just coins, when he could ease the burden on his mother's weary shoulders. Yet, the weight of uncertainty pressed upon him, like the thick fog that rolled in from Lake Michigan, obscuring the horizon. The night was not just a backdrop for dreams, it was a time of danger and uncertainty. An unspoken rule governed the streets. Those who walked them after dark did so with a heightened sense of vulnerability. The whispers of the city revealed tales of violence. Gangs prowled the alleys, and a single scream could shatter the silence like glass. In the back of her mind, Mabel recalled the stories of women who had ventured out for supplies, only to return with harrowing tales of close calls and narrow escapes. As the hour grew late, Mabel settled into her chair, her eyes heavy with fatigue. A slight creak from the floorboards made her alert. Outside, the distant wail of a police siren cut through the night, a reminder of the law's strained presence in a city rife with disorder. She could hear the murmurs of the neighbors through thin walls, their conversations punctuated by the sound of children crying or the occasional bark of a dog. Each household carried its own burden, its own struggles against the tide of despair that threatened to consume them all. In the depths of the night, Agnes, the local midwife, made her rounds, her footsteps soft against the cobblestones as she navigated the darkened streets. She had attended to countless mothers, many of whom had faced complications due to inadequate medical care. The weight of loss was something she carried with her, a quiet sorrow that never fully dissipated. She had seen too many mothers die in childbirth, their hopes extinguished in an instant. Yet, there were moments of joy too, laughter echoing through the dimly lit rooms as new life emerged against all odds. In the shadows, a man lingered, shifting nervously from foot to foot. He was not a criminal by nature, but desperation had a way of twisting a person's morality. Earlier, he had found himself drawn to a grocery store's back entrance, the faint light illuminating the stacked crates of goods. His stomach growled in protest, and the thought of his own children, asleep and hungry at home, pushed him toward the brink of a terrible decision. Would the risk of being caught outweigh the need to feed his family? The night was thick with indecision, yet he remained rooted to the spot, frozen by fear and the weight of consequence. As the clock ticked toward midnight, the city settled into a restless slumber. The hum of distant trains and the occasional honk of a car horn provided a backdrop to the silence. Mabel's thoughts drifted back to the struggles of the day. She had stood in line at the soup kitchen, surrounded by others like her, faces lined with worry, hands clutching empty bowls. The soup, a thin broth of vegetables, was a meager offering, but a lifeline nonetheless. The line had snaked around the block, a testament to the growing needs of a community in crisis. In the Johnson home, the flicker of the oil lamp cast a soft glow, illuminating the worn faces of mother and son. Tommy had finally drifted into a restless sleep, his brow furrowed as dreams of better days danced just out of reach. Mabel watched him for a moment, her heart swelling with love and sorrow. She thought of the future, of what lay ahead for her boys. Would Tommy be forced into the factory for a life of toil? Would Billy's childhood be stolen by the harsh realities that loomed outside their door? With a sigh, Mabel turned to the window, peering out into the night. The street was empty, the shadows cloaking secrets she dared not ponder. She thought of the watchmen, the criminals, the mothers in labor, and the children who went to bed hungry. It was a delicate web of life and death, woven together by the choices made in the dark. Each person's story was intertwined with the next, a collective struggle against an unrelenting tide. The night wore on, each tick of the clock echoing like a heartbeat in the silence. Outside, a light rain began to fall, the droplets tapping gently against the window pane, mingling with the soft sighs of a city weary from its trials. The sound was soothing, a lullaby for those who had endured too much. Mabel closed her eyes for just a moment, allowing herself a brief escape from the burdens of reality. But as the clock struck 1, a distant shout jolted her awake. She opened her eyes, heart racing, as she strained to hear the commotion outside. A man's voice, raised in anger, echoed through the night. Mabel's heart sank. It was the kind of disturbance that could spell trouble. She rose from her chair, moving to the door, her breath caught in her throat as she listened intently. "Leave him be," she heard a woman's voice cry out. Mabel's heart raced as she imagined the scene unfolding outside her door. A fight? A robbery? The city had become a battleground, and even the night could not shield them from its violence. As she opened the door, the cold air enveloped her, sending a shiver through her bones. The street was alive with chaos, figures clashing in the darkness, angry voices overlapping in a cacophony of fear. A watchman stood off to one side, his face grim as he assessed the situation. "Break it up, boys," he called, but his voice was drowned out by the escalating tension. Mabel's instincts kicked in, her motherly heart urging her to step back inside, to protect her children from the dangers lurking just beyond their threshold. But a part of her felt compelled to intervene. "What's happening?" she called out, her voice trembling, yet steady. The consequences of the night were real, and she could not turn a blind eye. "Just a misunderstanding, ma'am," one of the men replied, though the wild look in his eyes suggested otherwise. Nothing to worry about. But Mabel knew better. The night was unpredictable, and the stakes were high. As the altercation began to settle, the figures began to disperse, leaving behind a palpable tension that hung in the air. Mabel breathed a sigh of relief, but her heart remained heavy. The city was in turmoil, and the night was fraught with peril. She turned to go back inside, closing the door gently behind her, sealing her family from the chaos outside. As the rain continued to fall, its rhythmic patter a reminder of the world beyond, Mabel returned to her chair. She wrapped her arms around herself, drawing comfort from the familiar fabric of her shawl. The night carried on, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her shoulders. Each tick of the clock marked the passage of time, a reminder that, in the darkness, life continued to unfold, bringing with it both trials and triumphs. The world outside the Johnson home was one of pain and struggle, yet within their walls, love and hope persevered. As Mabel settled into the quietude, she held tightly to the thought that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also the possibility of renewal. The night may have been dark, but for her family, the dawn would always come, and with it, the promise of a new day. As the day draws to a close, we pull back from the intimate struggles of Mabel and her family to consider the larger tapestry of the Great Depression, a time when over 12 million Americans faced unemployment, an astonishing 25% of the workforce. The echoes of their lives resonate far beyond the confines of Chicago's South Side, intertwining with the broader narrative of a nation grappling with despair and resilience. This tumultuous decade, which began with the stock market crash of 1929, would extend until the dawn of World War II in the early 1940s, marking over a decade of hardship that would ultimately reshape American society. In the midst of despair, the government's response manifested in the form of Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. This series of programs aimed to provide relief and recovery, both economic and social. By 1934, approximately 8 million men participated in the Civilian Conservation Corps, working on projects that not only employed them, but also revitalized the nation's infrastructure. These efforts were not just about survival, they were about rebuilding hope. Yet, for many families like the Johnsons, hope was a fragile commodity, often overshadowed by the stark realities of daily existence. Mabel, like countless others, represented a demographic that was profoundly affected by this economic calamity. The maternal mortality rate soared during these years, with statistics revealing that as many as 1 in 5 mothers did not survive childbirth, an alarming figure that underscored the vulnerabilities faced by families. The fear of losing loved ones compounded the anxiety of providing for them, as resources dwindled and rationing became an unfortunate norm. The human cost of the Great Depression is staggering. More than 200,000 Americans lost their lives in related incidents, from starvation to violence born of desperation. The streets saw a rise in crime, with reports indicating a 25% increase in robberies as families fought to secure basic needs. Mabel's reminder to her sons about locking the door was not merely a precaution, it was a haunting reflection of the world outside. A world where survival sometimes meant taking desperate measures. Yet, within this dire landscape, the spirit of the American people shone through. The resilience of families who, like Mabel's, clung to one another, forged bonds that were tested but never broken. John Steinbeck, an emblematic figure of this era, captured the essence of their struggles in his seminal work, The Grapes of Wrath. His portrayal of the working class illuminated their plight and gave voice to the voiceless, echoing the sentiments of many who felt forgotten. By the time the war effort began to mobilize the nation, the economy had shifted. The unemployment rate, which had reached its zenith, began to decline as factories turned from making goods to munitions, pulling millions back into the workforce. The legacy of the Great Depression would not simply be one of hardship. It would serve as a catalyst for significant social change and reform in American policies and attitudes toward labor and welfare. As we reflect on this era, we acknowledge the lessons learned from the struggles faced by families like Mabel's. Their endurance amidst adversity laid the groundwork for the social safety nets that would follow, legacies that continue to influence policies today. The Great Depression taught a nation the importance of solidarity, compassion, and resilience. In these quiet moments, as the candlelight flickers and the world outside settles into stillness, we remember the lives lived in desperation and hope. We honor their stories, knowing that they shaped the fabric of our society, reminding us of the strength found in unity. Though the struggles of the past linger in the shadows, we emerge with a deeper understanding of our shared history, carrying forward the lessons learned, echoes of resilience that will never fade into silence.